The topic of this video is Nietzsche's typology, and we will compare it with Plato's typology. But I think really the topic of this video is movement. Movement of the soul, movement of the body, movement of matter, movement in any kind of forms that precisely create forms. We will see that with Plato's model, the souls undergo a long travel in the time between their death and their new reincarnation in a new body, and during this travel will be decided the fate of their future life. But with Nietzsche, we meet a completely different typology, a typology that is based on his notion of nature, his physiological philosophy, as he calls it, and we will see that his typology is full of references, has emerged from this physiological philosophy, this philosophy of nature that is a philosophy of the becoming. So maybe I should explain why I say it will be about movement. Movement is what creates, for Plato, the reality that we know. He says that the soul, by nature, is pure movement. He calls the soul the self-mover. There is something in everything that has a soul that is able to make move something physical, because he says that a living being, what we call a living being, is in fact the association between a soul and an element of matter which by itself would be completely inert, would be completely without any movement. But this association makes living beings as we know them. And for Plato, gods are pure movement. They are pure self-moving entities. But in Nietzsche's case, movement is a different thing. Movement is all around. It's like suddenly, in quite a pantheistic way, everything in nature has a soul. There is a soul in everything, and movement is absolutely everywhere. So we are, of course, past several centuries that separates Plato from Nietzsche, and in between those centuries many other thinkers have come. And maybe one thing that we should underline from the beginning is that Nietzsche enters this scene in the 19th century in Germany, in Europe, and at that time there have been already several revolutions, scientific revolutions. Of course, the one that started with Copernicus, Galileo and Descartes, then the one that continued with Kant and Hegel brought again the philosophy of Heraclitus, the philosophy of the becoming, inside the flow of philosophy. And so we have something that will develop over the course of the 19th century with, for example, of course, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which is really a thought about the development of life, not as Plato would have thought about it in a quite static way, but in a very dynamic way. And you would have also to take into account the theory of thermodynamics, which has a huge influence over the thinkers of the time and over Nietzsche in particular. So that's it about movement. Why is it about movement? We're going to talk now more precisely about the types. I will introduce the subject first in Plato, then I will try to explain what are the difficulties to understand Nietzsche's typology. We will study Nietzsche's typology in only one book, Twilight of the Idols, and you will see that it's already a lot to go through. But before that, let's come back to Plato and let me give you the framework of this exercise. In his famous dialogue, the Phaedrus, Plato addresses the question of love, love as a kind of divine madness. The book, the Phaedrus, the dialogue was written in 370, circa 370 BCE. And in that dialogue, Plato at one point would decide to talk about a very ancient theme that was probably inherited from ancient Egypt, At least that's what certain scholars do believe. And this theme, this myth or this allegory is usually called the chariot allegory, because Plato describes the human souls and also the souls of the gods as chariots that are composed of three members. There is the charioteer, there is two horses that pull the chariot in the sky, in the heavens. And for Plato, there is, from the beginning, from the start, a difference between human souls and divine souls. The souls of the gods are all perfect. The charioteer is perfect and the two horses are perfect. But when we consider human souls, while the charioteer has some perfection, he is the one that is closest to the gods, and usually the charioteer is associated with reason, with logos, and is the one that is supposed to, of course, drive the chariot. And the two horses for human beings are not so perfect. There is one that is more perfect than the other. The one that is more perfect is the white horse, and the one that is less perfect is the black horse. So the white horse in Plato's vocabulary is associated with the thumos, that is the spirit in English, the center of emotion and courage. And the black horse is associated with epithumia, which is appetites, desires associated with the guts, with the stomach, and so on. So this chariot, this assembly, little assemblage, is a figuration of the soul in this ancient theme of the reincarnation of the souls. Because the theme that is inherited from Egypt is the theme of metempsychosis, the theme of reincarnation, meaning that when one human soul dies, then that soul would rejoin a cycle where the souls are driving their chariots through the heavens and try to attain as much truth as they can. To do that, they must go step by step further into the highness of the skies, of the heavens, and they cannot do that except by following a god. So they need to know themselves well enough to be able to know which god they should follow. And if they are able to do that, then they begin their ascension. And if they are good enough at driving their chariot, then at one point they will, following the gods, go over the edge of the heavens, over the rim, and beyond the rim lies the place where the eternal beings exist forever. To take a glimpse, to have a glimpse, just a glimpse is enough, at those eternal beings beyond the heavens, will allow the soul to reincarnate into a human beings. And the more of those truth, those eternal truth, the soul will be able to see, the more the fate, its future fate in its future reincarnation will be better, will be virtuous, will be close to the truth. So this is, in Plato's dialogue, something that happens in section 244a to 250c. I will read now from a translation dating from 2002 by Robin Waterfield. So I will start reading at this moment when the souls have a chance to take a glimpse at what lies beyond the rim of the sky. The reason why there is so much determination to see the whereabouts of the plane of truth is not only that the proper food for the best part of the soul happens to come from the meadow there, but also that it is in the nature of the wings which raise the soul to be nourished by this region. It is the decree of destiny that any soul which attends a god and catches even a glimpse of the truth remains free from injury until the next revolution. And if it is able to do this every time, it will continue to be free from harm. But souls which fall behind and lose their vision of the truth, and are for some unfortunate reason or another weighed down by being filled with forgetfulness and weakness, lose their wings thanks to this burden and fall to earth. At this point, they are subject to a law that they are not to be planted into the bodies of animals in their first incarnation. The souls which have seen the most are to enter the seeds of men who will become philosophers, lovers of beauty, men of culture, men who are dedicated to love. The second group, those of law-abiding kings or military commanders or civic leaders. The third group, those of politicians, estate managers or businessmen. The fourth group, those of men who love exercising in a gymnasium or future experts in bodily health. The fifth group will live as prophets or as initiators into one of the mystery cults. The sixth group will most suitably live as poets and or some other kind of representative artist. The seventh as artisans or farmers. The eighth as sophists or demagogues. And the ninth as tyrants. So we see in this passage Plato creating something. For us it looks completely out of the blue, of course, but at the time it was rooted in a culture, and it is a hierarchy of different types of human beings, according, of course, that is Plato's criteria, to how much truth they have been able to see in their travel with the gods. So they have lost their wings because they were not able to maintain their chariot on the right course, and so they're falling down to earth. They are not reincarnated into animals. There's a law, Plato tells us, that forbids it. But instead they are reincarnated into human beings. So we can feel that it is already a kind of decay to reincarnate into a human being. Even if it's better than an animal, it is still something that is much less than gods, of course. So this reincarnation takes place into one of those 10 types that Plato has described here. Let us look at them in more details. So, of course, at the very top we have the philosophers, lovers of beauty and culture. So it's more, it's wider than just philosophers, but we understand that here philosophers are people, like the etymology says, who love wisdom. They are not wise people. You can see that the wise people would be more adequately put with another category, probably those of the prophet and mystery cult initiators, so that would be religious wise men. And in eighth position you have, of course, the sophists and demagogues, so the one who pretend to be wise but who are actually, according to Plato, only manipulating language so as to present something as true, but something that has actually no real truth in it. This manipulation, of course, of the truth, the manipulation not of the truth but of language, is something that the sophists do in order to fill their pocket with money, because this is a motive, a pattern that Plato repeats in his dialogues. The sophists want to earn money. They are interested not in the truth, but they are interested in earthly matters. In the middle there are a couple of other types. We have the law-abiding kings, military commanders and civic leaders in second position, so it's quite high position. Then we have the politicians, estate managers and businessmen. So we see that for Plato, politics and economy are very important elements of a society. In number 4, we have the athletes and doctors, so something that has to do with the body, and here we see that Plato is not rejecting the body, but calls for a certain discipline of the body. The athlete is the one who cultivates his own body or her own body, and the doctor who takes care of the bodies. Then you see that religion is put in the middle, number 5. And of course in number 6 we've got the poets and imitative artists. So poets, we know from the Republic that Plato had something against the poets if and only if they didn't comply to his ideas that the poets should present with true tales, so tales inspired by the truth and not tales that are imitating something wrong. And we remember that in the Republic, the guardians of the ideal city, the guardians, the philosophers, have to give to the artists, to the poets, the guidelines on how they should create their tales. Because for Plato, the poets are only good at imitating, they are not good at seeing the truth with the mind's eye. Then we have craftsmen and farmers, and here already we are with the guts and the stomach, with the people that in his Republic Plato would put at the bottom of his pyramidal hierarchy, and then the sophists and demagogues, and to finish the tyrants. So those ones, obviously, they have to be put outside of the city, they have to be chosen outside. So with this, we have a first look at a typology. Plato is really trying to make here something that would serve all human beings to evaluate the importance of the different people they meet in real life. So who should we hold for the most important people? Who is the most important? Who should we put at the very head of our societies? Well, Plato is quite explicit here. We should put kings at the top, law-abiding kings, under the supervision of philosophers. Law-abiding kings, it's quite obvious, they are obeying the laws, and in Plato's Republic, the laws are created by the guardians. Now, military commanders and civic leaders, that has also all to do with Plato, the place that Plato gave to the spirit associated with the heart and with the arms. So the capacity that those people, the police, the militaries, are actually having to put some order in the society and to protect the society from the outside. So there is a need in Plato's ideal city for this force, repressive force that will engage and repress people who won't follow the rules. That is important, and it is an idea, of course, of stability that is very strong in Plato's model, because Plato's model, his ideal city, really aims towards harmony and really works only as a wall that would be harmonious if everyone in this typology follows their own nature in a virtuous way. So, for example, the militaries should be courageous, that is the virtue that is attached to the spirit. Of course, the philosophers should be wise, they should exert their reason in the best way possible in order to create good laws, while the people, the farmers, the craftsmen, everybody in the populace should try to exert moderation on their appetites, so that there can be an harmonious totality. So now that we have an idea here of this typology, of Plato's typology, let us come back on the criterion that he used to create it. For us it's a bit abstract, but remember it's an allegory. And in this allegory there is one thing that is for certain, it is that the charioteer, the one who is guiding the chariot, is reason. So to think well, and to think well following Socrates is to think virtuously. So we should aim toward what is good, what is virtuous, and at the same time aim towards what is true. And if we can do that with our reason, and have a reason that is strong enough to hold the black horse, the appetite that wants to go in another way and try to go and eat some earthly flowers or I don't know what, and the white horse also, we need to hold it, we need to have a good bridle, we need to harness those two horses, but the white horse would listen to what reason says. It's more easy to guide its will not go into the direction of the black horse, while the black horse is always trying to disturb the white horse and take it with him in its course downwards. So the charioteer really has to maintain his course so that the whole chariot, the whole soul goes upwards, following the gods and eventually reaching the edge of the heaven and being able to contemplate the meadow where all the eternal truth lie. So with this in mind, we have to now make a completely different kind of thinking if we want to understand what's happening in Nietzsche's philosophy and how Nietzsche did develop his own typology. Of course, we will have to check what is Nietzsche's critique of Plato's model, but we will see that there are some interesting proximities, some interesting resemblances between the two philosophers. So let's now look into Nietzsche. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche sets out his own typology based on a different criterion. So our work will be to discover on which criterion he based his typology, and also to discover the different types that he profiled in his work Twilight of the Idols. To do the latter, what we can do is just pick up a book with an index, of course, and try to look at the different notions that we know are important for Nietzsche, like, of course, the overhuman, the great man, noble culture. There is also, of course, his critique of rationalists. We have not to forget the ones that he evaluated negatively, like members of the herd, the priests, which incarnate the spirit of resentment, and so on. So we have different kinds of notions that are very important in Nietzsche's mind, and those notions much often they are represented by actual persons. Nietzsche criticized many of his contemporaries and many figures of the past, and he associated, for example, the type of the great man with people like César Borgia or Julius Caesar or Goethe. So artists, politicians, different kind of people. So at least we see that it's not the same as in Plato. We don't have the same kind of typology. It's a different one. But maybe it's best, now that we have just set this landscape, to enter into the search for the criteria Nietzsche has based his typology on. So how does this work? Well, we know a little bit that Nietzsche had a certain propension not to give his thought in a systematic way. He didn't appreciate systematic thinkers, saying that they lack intellectual probity. He says that because he says that those people, for example, they base everything on the highest notion that they have discovered. For example, God. And he says, well, but this notion, they have discovered it at the very end of the process of their research. And so they put at the very beginning, as a creator of everything, something that they have discovered at the very end of their process of thinking. Therefore, he says they lack intellectual probity. About his critique of the systematic way of presenting a philosophy, his mind is quite, his idea is quite simple here. He says, well, we can only look at things during a small amount of time. We cannot look at it forever. We cannot have a mind that is opened on the world 24 hours on 24, 7 days on 7. So it's not possible to have actually a constant gaze on what happens around us. So we just have glimpses. And so to create something that is systematical, of course it would be artificial, because nobody has the capacity to do it and to be conscious of everything at the same time. So it's like a game of construction. Yeah, I'm putting this here and this here and this here, and hopefully every time I look at it, it holds. But in fact, you never know if it holds for real, because you are never capable of looking at the whole thing from just one gaze, one look at it, a complete, total look at it. So that is it for Nietzsche's critique of systematic thinking. So what did Nietzsche? Well, Nietzsche had this habit of entering very fast in a problem. He says it's like entering cold water. When you take a bath in cold water, you enter very fast, you enjoy it, you live it fully, and then you go out. You don't stay forever in it because you can't do it. And for him, thinking was like that. So doing this, and knowing that he didn't want to lack intellectual probity, that was one of the value he respected. So he wanted to give to his readers something that would be akin to this way of thinking. So when you are reading Nietzsche, you can expect that. You can expect that he won't throw at you a system of thought, but he will take you every time in an adventure, in a quick bath into something. And it has to be as clear and pristine as possible, like crystal clear vision, but temporary, momentary, like to seize a problem, to seize an event, a situation, a moral complication or something, and then go out of the water and try something else. Of course, behind it, you have memory and you think about those things, so things accumulate and you begin to see other things, to make connections. And that's one of the difficulty in reading Nietzsche. It is that sometimes he refers to connections that he has made in a past book or in another paragraph of the same book. So if you want to understand Nietzsche, you have to compare between paragraphs, because every time he might give a different nuance. And those nuances are what is the most important in Nietzsche's philosophy, because Nietzsche's philosophy is a philosophy of the becoming, so there will never be just one ultimate statement about something, because the thought is becoming like everything else. The thought is a creation of nature, and as such, it is a becoming, it is a going forward. So once we have this in mind, we can try to read and compare different passages of Nietzsche's philosophy to try to see what is relevant for our task here today. So let us try to understand the criterion, which is at the very basis of Nietzsche's philosophy. We know that in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche has a very important passage in which he wrote that everything is will to power, that the will to power, the whole world is will to power. And so from that passage, we can really try to hold to this idea. Even if some critics have said that this notion was underdeveloped in Nietzsche's published works, actually when we read at his unpublished fragments, when we compare and when we read in depth what Nietzsche says about the will to power in his published writings, I believe, following in that thinkers like Wolfgang Müller-Lauter, who published a great book on the physiology of the will to power, I believe that we can really enter into Nietzsche's philosophy in the best way possible through that concept, and through that concept understood with physiology. So physiology of the will to power, that will be, in my view here, the criterion on which we could base this typology of Friedrich Nietzsche. So the will to power, what is the will to power? I will go quite fast on the topic, but I will give some basic elements and then begin to enter into what allows Nietzsche to create different types. Because it's not enough to have only one principle. You have to understand how it works and how it generates movements that are going upwards and movements that are going downwards in Nietzsche's vocabulary, decadence is going downwards, and ascending life, ascending forms of life are going upward. Let us remember from Heraclitus' saying, everything flows. Everything flows, everything is will to power, everything becomes. You never enter twice into the same river. You are never yourself twice the same person when you enter into a river that is not two times the same. So everything becomes. But what is becoming? What is the nature of the becoming? Nietzsche says that the nature of the becoming is a will to power. A will doesn't mean that there is something or someone that wants or someone that desires. It's not about that. It's something that is inherent to the becoming itself. It's a movement forward. That's all what means will in this context. But a will to power. So a movement forward towards power. What is power? Power here, we have to understand it with two words, I think. The first one is action. In German, Wille zur Macht. Macht is about power in the sense of political might, but it's also about the possibility to do more things and to be active in a very complete way, as complete as possible actually. And that would be the first word, action. The second word would be growth. So the will to power is a movement forward towards growth. Like a plant will try and always will try to build more of itself, to live more fully, to be able to create flowers and then seeds and so on, and to perpetuate itself, but also to enhance itself in a way. And how does it enhance itself? We will question this in a moment. You can take also, of course, a stone. A stone is will to power because a stone, as an atomical structure, is made of molecules that will continue in their existence, and they will continue to exist. They will move forward. The matter itself is this moving forward. Now, of course, if you take an animal, that seems quite more obvious to us. An animal will try not only to survive, but will try to reproduce itself, to grow stronger, to grow bigger, etc. And human beings are just the same way. So it's a movement towards growth and action. There's nothing about here something that would be inactivity. Nothing is really inactive in that definition. You have only different degrees of activity, different degrees of growth. And so we can understand already from that setup that there are different, within these different degrees, you have movement that will be rather decaying or rather ascending, depending on the relation they have with their environment, with the other things around us. So this is the next step we have to take now to understand the will to power. But first, let me give a precision. The will to power is not one thing, it's a multiplicity. It's from the beginning, there is no beginning actually, but it is multiplicity. There is never one continuous whole will to power that would be akin to the idea we have of God usually. So to think that the will to power have some plans or wants to do something or something is actually not what Nietzsche had in mind. Nietzsche had in mind a multiplicity of forces that move forward in a chaotic way, that sometimes creates something that is akin to order, that is akin to taking a shape and prosper as an organic being. An organic life form is something quite peculiar. We know it. In the universe, it is an exception. Most of the time what is happening is a pure rushing of forces that gives, for example, the great stars and all the elements of the universe. So we are here in a situation, us human beings, we know it, in a very peculiar situation, and we have to take that into account and to have somehow to take into account that this perspective that we have on life is also determined by our very shape, by our very existence. All right. So this moving forward of the will to power, this multiplicity of forces that move forward against each other, they have no predetermined association. They will meet and maybe they will associate, maybe they will fight against each other, maybe one will take over the other, maybe they will adapt together to a force that is even stronger than the two of them. It's a question that is always dynamic. So we are thinking always in a dynamic way. For example, you can take a human society. Of course, humans now are thinking they are superior to animals, and they think that because they were able to master many animals. They, of course, are able to kill animals with their techniques, and this way they think they are the dominant species on the planet Earth. But now, let us look at the picture from a different side. Of course, if we consider that Earth is an entity, then we have to think that the Earth is actually a stronger being than the human beings, and that all what the human beings have done since they are human beings, or since before that, of course, is to adapt to earthly conditions. So to the forces that are present on the planet, and of course the human beings have to go and find some food, they have to find some shelter, because our surroundings, the natural elements, are so much more powerful than we are. And if the Earth was disappearing, was collapsing because of human activity, of course the human species will disappear. So there is here really a very strong question about the question of relativity. So we are always strong or weak relatively to something else. The same goes for ascendant and decadent. We are always ascendant in comparison, in relation with something else, not in comparison, in relation. So you have, for example, you had a very bad day and you are feeling very down, and suddenly you are having an ascending movement. Well, of course, your ascending movement is only relative to what you were feeling before. That is, the distance you can make from one point to the other is relative to where you started. So this is something we should keep in mind also. It's a relative philosophy, and it is extremely important because the whole 20th century will be entering fully into that relative way of thinking, of course with Einstein, of course with constructivism, psychology, sociology, anthropology. All those disciplines have to think about human beings in a relative way. They have to be thoughtful about the fact that the observer also is always determining what the observer observes. And that is part also of a relation, because our will to truth, our will to know something, is also a will to power, according to Nietzsche. It is part of our human nature to have this will to know the truth, this will to understand what is going on around us. And so this will to truth being itself a form of the will to power, we have to take into account that it is, if we want to know something. Right. So we have those two movements, decadent, ascendant. We know that, for example, Nietzsche talked about Socrates as a decadent. Socrates, of course, is a decadent only when we relate him to the Greece of his time, to the society of Athens at the time. And for Nietzsche, Socrates is a decadent because Socrates went away from the values that preceded him. And Nietzsche said actually Socrates was just the first of the decadent, because all the Greek society was already in decay at the time, and Socrates was like the avant-garde of that decadence. He was the first one, and he brought some solutions to go forward within this decadence, and not, as it was believed for many centuries, as an ascendant type. He was not an ascendant type, he was misunderstood as an ascendant type, but Nietzsche says, well, nowadays, with me, Friedrich Nietzsche, we can see that Socrates was actually a decadent, and that the whole philosophy that he created was decadent also. So Nietzsche wants to come back and re-establish another typology than the one, of course, Plato had created on the basis of Socrates' philosophy. Socrates associated two things, truth and virtue. For Socrates, the two things are compatible, they are even identical. You are virtuous when you are looking after the truth, and looking after the truth makes you virtuous. Somehow you cannot have the truth if you are an evil person. And that we can see in Plato's typology. The tyrant is only interested by himself, his own self-interest, and as a consequence, Plato thinks that he could not have possibly seen any of the true ideas that lie beyond the edge of the heaven. So with that, now we can look at this equation, the Socratic equation, as Nietzsche calls it, reason equals virtue, from Nietzsche's point of view. And Nietzsche's point of view is to say, well, this equation is wrong. Well, it's wrong. It belongs to a decadent, to a form of life that goes downward. Why? Because it is actually a decision that had to be taken in an emergency. The Greek society was in decay. Every desires were going in every direction. There was no possibility to harness the forces that were so powerful in ancient Greece. You remember that the way ancient Greek, in Nietzsche's opinion, harnessed their forces was to wage war against each other, against each city-states. So they waged war against each other, and like that they were able to live in prosperity within each city-states. The citizens were not killing each other. Instead, they prospered. But it was only thanks to the fact that they were waging war against each other on the outside, city-state against city-state. They were being to express all those forces that they had inside them, and to express it in a way that Nietzsche deemed tragic. The word is very important, we'll come back to it later. Tragic meaning that they were really looking at what they were doing in the face. They were not looking away. And so those values, this whole culture, at one point enter in a decay. And the forces were not able to harness those forces anymore. So what Socrates did was to put what Nietzsche calls a counter-tyrant. So the forces, all the drives, the desires, wanted to play the tyrants. And they wanted to have all the place for themselves. They did not want to play anymore in the culture that the Greeks had created to harness them. So they wanted to go every one of them in their own direction. So Socrates pushed up one instinct, the will to truth, and he said, well, we have to order every other instinct according to that one, according to reason. And to say that, he valued positively the instinct of reason, the will to truth, by saying that it was identical to virtue. So of course, to be virtuous, you had to be reasonable. And like that, reason was able to harness every other desires. And we have again, of course, the image of the charioteer. Charioteer is reason, and the charioteer is able to harness the white horse and the black horse. Well, Nietzsche says that was a situation of emergency, and Socrates had to do that. He had to find a way to harness all those desires, those drives going astray. But in another situation, in a situation in which life could be ascendant, this wouldn't be the situation, this wouldn't be the case. The drives, the forces would go together, like it was the case before Socrates, when the Greek culture was at its most mature moment. And at that moment, you don't need to have reason governing over everything. Indeed, it would be a complete disaster if reason had come 1 century earlier, if Socrates would have come 1 century earlier. Well, probably people would just have laughed at him. Nobody would have taken him seriously. That's Nietzsche's opinion on the topic. So in a situation like that one, a situation of cultural maturity, the equation is different. It's not reason equals virtue. It's reason doesn't equal virtue. So you can have reason, of course, you can think about things, you can be a philosopher, you can decipher many mysteries, but you cannot associate the two things together, because there are some things that are done and that are made in the name of other desires which are not reasonable, which are the black horse or the white horse. And those things that you do have as much value as something you do because of reason. So, for example, to wage war against the different city-states, that doesn't seem to be something reasonable to do, but they did it, and they did it at the apex of their own culture. So there is in Nietzsche the attempt to make some space for a new society, a new mature society. So he calls for a maturation of societies. And for that, you have to push reason a little bit away, to stop this tyranny of reason over everything. Otherwise, reason will always continue to push the other forces down, and as a consequence, the decadent movement will continue to happen, as a matter of fact. So to create a counter-movement to the movement of decadence, Nietzsche tried to complete a philosophy that would be able to think beyond good and evil, that is, beyond virtue, beyond this association between virtue and reason. And that is where Nietzsche tried to go with this philosophy of the will to power. So, philosophy of the will to power is the philosophy of all the forces, not only the will to truth that is governing over everything, but every force. And every will, every force, every desires, we will try to look at how they assemble together, what kind of dynamic they can produce. And this is why also Nietzsche is coming back with the notion of being a physician of culture very often, because he looks at a society, at a community, as a composition of different forces. Those different forces, they are always interpreted. There is always somebody saying something, interpreting what is going on, etc., and saying, oh, I'm doing that. But actually, are we certain that what we are doing, that what we say we are doing, is really what we are doing? Sometimes we actually say we are doing something as an excuse to do something else, and that is something that is very relevant with modern psychology, of course, because we know that sometimes we are in a situation where we give ourselves some excuses or some justifications to do something, but actually it's another desire behind it that is pushing and trying to give a certain shape, a certain face to our reality, so that we can enter into that desire without second thoughts, without feeling guilty, etc., etc. So, with that in mind, we can enter a little bit further into the situation and try to ask ourselves the question of another criterion that Nietzsche thought would be the proof of cultural maturity. How do we attain cultural maturity? What is cultural maturity, or an ascending way for any kind of cultures? So let's look at that. To understand this other criterion that I'm going to speak about now, maybe it's easier to begin with its negative side. We know that Nietzsche was a harsh critic of Christianity. Why is that? Because in his opinion, Christianity had followed the path downward that had been drawn in the first place by Socrates, Plato, and their followers. And what happened with this tyranny of reason was that little by little there was a hatred of the body that appeared. Nietzsche thought that even at the beginning, the body was too much to handle. The forces, the drives were too much to handle. So naturally there was something like a hatred of the body that appeared. And in Christianity it took another phase with the Christian church. Let's not speak here about the message of Jesus of Nazareth, because Nietzsche has a different opinion on it. But with Saint Paul and the creation of the church, there is something that becomes heavier and heavier in this hatred of the body. The priest is characterized by what Nietzsche calls the spirit of resentment. So he resents many things around him, he resents his own desires, and of course he will drive all the believers, the followers, the herd, into this hatred of the body within. So what is going on if we hate the body? What happens, says Nietzsche, is that there is a division in the human life form. On one side you have reason, you have the head somehow cut from the body, flying in the sky with God, and on the other side you have the body that is probably whose destiny is probably to end up in hell or to end up in being dirt. So this is the vision of the body that stems from Christianity. Now, of course, Christianity has evolved since Nietzsche, but we can still find many of those elements in the Christian beliefs. So we have here a situation of what I will call a disjunction. There is a disjunction between two parts of the human beings, between different forces inside the human beings, and those forces cannot go back together. So that's what Nietzsche tries to do, is to reintegrate the will to truth within the whole life form of the human being. So there is a notion that somehow the more integrated the forces are in a whole, the more possibilities there is for an ascendant form of life. And indeed, that's something we read in Nietzsche, for example, and that's, I think, one very important passage from Twilight of the Idols. It's in section 9, the reconnaissance raids of an untimely man. It's paragraph 49, if I'm not mistaken, and I will read it to you now. It talks about Goethe. Goethe did not divorce himself from life, but he immersed himself in it. He never lost heart and took as much as possible upon himself, above himself, into himself. What he wanted was totality. He fought against the disjunction of reason, sensuality, feeling, will. Preached in the most repulsive scholastic way by Kant, Goethe's antipode. He disciplined himself into a whole, he created himself. So this created himself is really here the moving forward of the will to power in its most splendid manifestation for Nietzsche, creation. And remember that Nietzsche thought that nature, who takes the figure of Dionysus in his writings, nature is the creator per excellence. Nature is the one thing that invents itself, because there is always this struggle, this moving forwards, without any second thought, without reason coming to disturb the becoming. There is a becoming that is pure, and this pure rush of the different forces creating matter in different shapes and different becomings. So, of course, in nature there is no disjunction between reason, sensuality, feeling, will. There is just a wall going on. There is this movement forward towards action and growth. So we have here, I think, a very important passage, and what Nietzsche calls this will to totality, the way Goethe was able to discipline himself into a whole, to create himself. We see also in this paragraph the opposition that Nietzsche draws between Goethe on one side and Kant. Kant, with his critique of pure reason, tried to give an ultimate possibility for reason to achieve what Plato and his followers and Descartes and others had tried to do with reason, that is, use reason to govern over everything and to be able to guide human beings towards a just and fair society, that is, a virtuous society. So if you follow the true philosophy, then you will, at the end up with a just and fair society. But we saw, and that is the history of the Industrial Revolution, of the revolutions of the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Nothing is happening according to Kant's plans, and everything is going astray. There is a huge transformation of the human societies, and suddenly comes into the mind of some people that this linear progress towards a just and fair society that will be governed by truth was a complete misunderstanding. That actually that misunderstanding, according to Nietzsche, began with Socrates and ended with him. He was the one to unveil the misunderstanding. So for Nietzsche, there's really, with Kant and then with Hegel, the coming to an end of this movement downward, and Nietzsche comes and turn it on the other side. He tries to create that counter movement in which we will be able to foster a more mature, the possibility for maturing of our culture, of our society. And we will see that he does that with also one very important word that was already a feat of ancient Greece. It is tragedy and the notion of the tragic. Now, if we have this criterion, this notion that the ascendant type, the more ascendant is the one which has the higher degree of integration of the forces together, we might still not have answered the one which is maybe for us the most important question: how those instincts, how those forces, should they work together? But Nietzsche won't give us an answer here. He's just creating, if you want, the setup. Now, it depends on each group, each individual, each culture to discover their own forces and to do something with it. Nietzsche doesn't give any answer to say that. He just gives us a way to think the becoming of the forces, and not to enter again into a downward movement, but to try to be able to see it before it happens and to change it and to correct our course. But then that is the work of culture, of communities, of humanities, to try to actually do that. As he says about Goethe, Goethe created himself. So Goethe was this force of nature at one point, which was able to create itself. And do we really have a choice about it? Not so much, not in the sense of the free will, at least. It's not that we are able to do the right thing or do the wrong thing. It's not about that. That is Plato's and Christian philosophy that propose us to see things that way. So for Nietzsche here, we are a piece of nature, a piece of fate, and what happens will happen. But we have the possibility to understand what is going on and to play the philosophers with nature itself. We have the possibility to create ourselves as part of nature and not as something that is outside of nature. That is the big difference. There is this very important line at the beginning. Again, Goethe did not divorce himself from life, but immersed himself in it. He never lost heart and took as much as possible upon himself, above himself, into himself. So it's not the question that we should, for example, not have gods and should be gods instead of gods. It's not the question. The question is what we are able to enter in relation with. because we cannot just stay in our very limited small universe that is determined by reason. This is like an obfuscation of our very nature and our very powers. We have many forces that can go in different directions and give different combination, and that would be probably a big loss to just leave some outside, try to push them out, instead of understanding them and trying to cultivate them in another sense. So we have now two criteria and one core concept. The core concept is the will to power, and the two criteria are ascendant or decadent, and a degree of integration that life form is able to do that, not is able, that a life form is of its different forces. The more integrated their forces are, the more the life form is ascendant. And on the other side, of course, we have the disjunction that is making us go downward. So now that we have this, I think we are ready to enter into the typology of Nietzsche. So try to order the different types that he saw. And to do that, I think I will begin by talking briefly about somehow the shape we should give to this typology, to this possible hierarchy, but we need to discuss that. When we looked at Plato's typology before, it seemed quite obvious to us to put it in a pyramidal kind of shape. You have the philosophers on top, then you have the auxiliaries, that is the law-abiding kings, and the military, then you have the business owners and the merchants, etc. Then you have the doctors and the athletes, okay, and the people at the end, right? And outside of the city, that should be put away aside from the cities, the tyrants and the sophists, all right? So it seems quite obvious also because we have this model of the ideal city in the Republic. But already in Plato, there is something that is a bit weird, because this is the story in the Phaedrus about reincarnations of souls. And so we understand that any soul can fall at any moment. So somehow there is something that is more organic and less divided into good and evil. It's not like that. It's something that is more complex and includes the dimension of a circle, of a circulation of the souls across because actually there's sometimes time lapse of 30,000 years before a soul can come back to being a philosopher. So there's a long way to do. Now, with Nietzsche, it's also very hard to put a definitive shape on that, and I think it's definitely not a pyramid, because actually what we read in Nietzsche is that the will to power needs always one and the other. And we can think again about Heraclitus. Heraclitus talks about the unity of the opposites. So the opposites are always working together. The weak and the strong in Nietzsche also work together, and they are both will to power. The weak will adapt. Its action and growth is in adapting to the pressure, to the force that the strong will put against the weak. And so that's what actually defines the weak as weak. He is not weak per se. He is weak because he is in a situation in which there is something or someone stronger than they are, and so they need to adapt. But in this adaptation, they are also very much will to power, and that is very important to remember. So the weak is characterized by adaptation and contraction, while the strong is characterized by expansion against contraction and by creativity. So there is creativity and adaptation, and there is expansion and contraction. So it's like two forces that always answer to each other. There is never a strong or a weak per se, and it's completely false to say that Nietzsche advocated for certain kind of values that would be per se values of the strong. Now, relatively to each other, of course, we can say that some values are stronger than others in a certain setup, in a certain situation. Some values, some virtues, some actions, some elements take the upper hand and will win over the others. But of course they dramatically need the others, the weak, in order to be strong. And remember always that the strong is always in its own place, the weak of something else. We talked about human beings and the planet Earth, or the solar system, or imagine whatever you want to create that perspective. It's very important. So if you want, it's like un ruban de Möbius ribbon. So there is always an upper side and an underside, but actually one can become the other, and it's actually part of one another. So it's really a dynamic thing that cannot be ultimately decided. What is weak, what is strong. It cannot be ultimately decided. And somehow that's the beauty of it. It's a possibility of transformation. It's a possibility of more creativity of nature and of human beings, of course, too. So we are with this situation, and we decided not to give a definitive shape to Nietzsche's typology. In the end, maybe we are with this Möbius ribbon kind of a shape. Still, there are, of course, types that Nietzsche values more positively than others. We have said that. So he values them positively just by saying that they are ascendant. So to say positively is maybe a mistake, because it's not morality. Nietzsche doesn't want to create a new morality, and he's always trying not to do that, not to create a new morality. But of course, people who would take his words literally would think that he's actually proposing a new morality, but he is not. He's trying to create a philosophy that makes us able to understand nature in its becoming. He is, like he says himself, a disciple of Dionysus, that is, of nature itself in its always transforming multiplicity of forces and becoming. So, reading Twilight of the Idols, I came up with a certain number of types that I will now present to you. Those types cannot be always distinguished totally from one another, so some are participating to one another, and always remember that we are in the situation of the Möbius ribbon. So the first one, obviously, the overhuman. And at the very bottom would be the priest with the spirit of resentment. The overhuman being the type of creativity, the type of the child that is able to create in the innocence of the becoming, that is without any pressure from the Socratic equation, without any feeling that he has to do or she has to do something, but with this pure feeling of creating his own becoming, their own becoming. At the very bottom, the priest, in the opposite way, is always under the burden of having to do something according to the truth, and according to truth equals virtue. And this having to always carry something on its back, the weight of the table of the law, gives the priest a lot of resentment against life and against his own body, that he is forbidden to follow. He is forbidden to follow his drives, to follow his desires, and therefore that harbors resentment inside him. So we have the top and the very bottom. We have the overhuman and the priest. And so from the beginning we see that, just like Plato, we are talking here about human types. We're not talking about types per se. We're talking about human types, and of course Nietzsche's framework of reference here is the society of his time and the knowledge he was able to acquire in books about the past. So it's not something that is definitive, it's a list and a typology that is, there is a call for a transformation of this understanding and of the examples also that Nietzsche takes. The overhuman, by the way, the word itself appears in my knowledge only once in Twilight of the Idols, and only to be compared to the higher man. So I will put those two types together in this typology, but you could go and read in Zarathustra, for example, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the passages on the overhuman at the very beginning of the book, and that would give you some insight about what Nietzsche understood by that. And very importantly, I would insist on that, it is overhuman, surhumain in French, and not overman or surhomme, because the German is Übermensch, and Mensch is human. It's not man. It's not gendered at all here. So the overhuman, at the very top with the great man, the higher man, the one Nietzsche calls also the genius. We can talk a little bit later about the genius, but all of those types, they are fate, once again. You cannot decide that you will become a great man. It's your fate. And you are driven towards the things that will make you great because it is in you. You have this degree of integration. Now we can discuss, is it something that is innate or something that is acquired? Well, we know with Nietzsche it's a very complicated, very important also discussion to have. Maybe I will discuss that more in detail in another video. And for now, just to say this, the fact that we are all productions of nature, and Nietzsche insists on the work of generations, the labor of generations. So generation after generation after generation will produce a certain assemblage of forces in an individual. It's a matter of chance for some parts. It's a matter of human will, desire over several generations too. But the alchemy between the two seems quite uncontrollable. It would be very mad, in my opinion, to have the project to create an overhuman just from scratch. Of course, we have dramatic examples with the Nazis, who in some ways thought that they could select some genetic elements by breeding the perfect race, etc. But that's not taking into account the fact that the first thing one needs to do in order to be an overhuman, to be a great man, is to overcome oneself, is to overcome this very society that has created us. So in a possible scenario, if the Nazis had won the war and somehow had been able to breed their perfect race, it's very probable that those characters, those overhumans, would have turned against the Nazis that had produced them and say that the Nazis had done a very bad job about a lot of things. But it is quite doubtful that the Nazis would have been able to produce any kind of overhuman anyway, because they had a very restricted way of seeing at things, and they tried to divide life against each other too much. They did not look for a productive and creative way of becoming with this human world of ours. We can see that also in the management they had of their society and so on. Let's not enter into too much details. So, in the end, what I wanted to say is that the great man is a production of nature, and that we should not try to look at it as something we can craft. It's not about that. It happens also because there is a becoming at one point in time. There is a culture that is ready, that is mature, and produces the great man. The great man somehow is called into action by a certain situation. It's like you have those multiplicity of forces that go forward. You have a society, you have thousands, millions of human beings doing things. You have suddenly a pandemic, you have suddenly something or something, and suddenly the situation is mature for the advent of a great person, a great man or a great woman that takes things into their hands and harness the forces present in that society to bring it to another level, to another stage of its history. So that is the notion of the higher man, of the genius too. Now, under it, I would put the tragic in general, but the tragic artist or the tragic philosopher. The tragic, of course, the great man is also tragic, so it doesn't make so much sense to separate the two of them, but many times Nietzsche speaks of the tragic artist, for example, about Goethe. But Goethe could also be understood as a great man in a way, but he is defined by Nietzsche as a tragic artist. So tragic, remember ancient Greece, when tragedy was invented, 5th century BCE, there was this attitude that was able to look at life as a complete thing. So life and death, joy and sadness, everything was part of it, and the Greeks were able to look at it in full because they had this ability to let go of their instincts, of their drives. They expressed all their drives, and that is what is tragedy. When you are able to express all of your drives in a way that doesn't kill you. Indeed, in the Greek situation, as Nietzsche analyzed it, it gives them even more life to live in this tragic attitude, within this tragic attitude. Nietzsche gives us Thucydides as a tragic thinker too, the great historian of ancient Greece. And of course we have Napoleon that is here as well, Caesar Borgia, Julius Caesar. Those are great men. Nietzsche looks at them quite highly. There is a question about why he took those examples. He was much criticized for that. I think one of the reasons he chose, for example, Caesar Borgia, who had, of course, terrible morals, I think that's precisely because of that. He wanted to give as example of his higher man, of his type, some persons, some historical characters that could not be associated by the Christians, by the Socratic philosophers, to something they knew, to something they would accept and tolerate as being a higher kind of type. So Nietzsche, I think, chose on purpose someone who was especially disreputable, especially immoral, so as not to be appropriated by people like the Christians and the Socratic philosophers. Now, Nietzsche had a true admiration, I believe, for Napoleon. He calls him ens realissimum, that means the most real thing in Latin. Ens realissimum is actually the word, the expression that was used before by Christians to talk about God. The most real thing is God. Now, Nietzsche, with this counter-movement, makes of the most real thing a person, a human being that was totally into action. Napoleon's life is a life of action, is a life of power, of might, of growth, of organization, of transformation of the society, etc. So, of conquest, of course, too. So it is, for Nietzsche, an example of those forces that have this tendency to take over, to overcome themselves, but also to take over other forces. Napoleon, at the beginning of the 19th century, was forces that took over Europe, as you know. And I think we should be still critic about Napoleon, because Napoleon put into place a very important bureaucracy that Nietzsche was very much against bureaucracy. So there's some contrast and nuances to give to the character and to Nietzsche's appreciation of it. But we have to understand why Nietzsche, and in what context, in what paragraph, in what text, Nietzsche gives some value, calls Napoleon a higher man or the ens realissimum. It's always in a context. So let's not make of Napoleon the absolute icon of the higher man. That would be quite stupid. So after the tragic, we would have the noble, and with those four names, the overhuman, the great man, genius, the tragic artist, and the noble, I think we have the four types which are directed towards ascendant life, that are actually ascendant types. The noble, Nietzsche uses this word to talk about Athens before Socrates, so before the decay. He talks also as noble about ancient Rome, about Renaissance. Renaissance is a very important period of time for Nietzsche. It's a time of cultural maturity. And I think that noble is akin to cultural maturity. Cultural maturity doesn't just reject things. It's having enough maturity to understand that life is multiple, that life is made of several different things, and that we cannot control it as a whole. I think that's the situation. So before we go into the decadent types, there is maybe one type that is on the threshold between the two. It is a type that is not really a type. I was a bit embarrassed with it, but since Nietzsche talks a lot about them, I think I will address it here, and I would name them the rationalist, the dialectician, and I would put together with it the pessimist. Those characters occupy a certain place in Nietzsche's mind. Firstly, because in Twilight of the Idols, the second part of the book, the problem of Socrates, is so important. It's at the starting of the book. We can feel in it that Nietzsche, of course, is criticizing Socrates, but at the same time, we feel there is some kind of admiration, some kind of way of looking at Socrates that acknowledges the fact that Socrates was a kind of a great man in a way, because he was really the product of the society of his time. So he was somehow a genius of decadence, if you want. We could say that. He was the higher man of decadence. And there have been many great philosophers in the rationalist side, on the rationalist side, so on the side who wanted to govern everything through reason. There is even some philosophers who, through the path of reason, they took that path, but in the end, they ended up with something completely different. Look at Spinoza, for example. Spinoza is a philosopher that have ended up with such a vision of the being, of reality, that it's completely mind-boggling. So the rationalists, the dialectician, they don't have to be at the very bottom. That's not the situation. So I put them in the middle. They are on this threshold between the ascendant and the decadent. Socrates is on the side of the decadent mostly because many people have followed Socrates in a way that was even more decadent. So I would say Socrates is somehow at the threshold. And in the same category, I have put the pessimists. The pessimist, like, of course, Schopenhauer, with a very important reference to Nietzsche. I will not comment on this for now, just to say that somehow the pessimist is the one who sees that the equation truth equal virtue is wrong, but he took this as an occasion for despair, for the thinking that there is no possible solution to actually life, so we should better think that life has no value at all, and that is the situation of nihilism too. Nihilism, the definition of nihilism is the people who have seen that the Socratic equation doesn't work, is not right, is not true, is not the thing that matters for them anymore. They are not even able to apply them, the discipline of the Socratic equation. They are not able to apply them the discipline of virtues, but they are not able to do anything else. So they despair and they end up believing in nothing, having no call for their will to power to grow in any way. So this is a situation with the nihilist that we will have to take into account to talk about the modern, because that would be my fifth type. So the modern. Nietzsche has an explicit way of talking about it. He says that the modern is in the state of physiological self-contradiction. So there is different forces in the modern, the one he calls the modern, and among them you would have Rousseau, Carlyle, Flaubert, Sainte-Beuve. All those are modern people, and he also called them nihilists. So people who are not quite able to apply themselves or to apply to their philosophy the Socratic equation, but who try nonetheless to go on the same path, so to continue on a path that have been proven false, if you want. And they continue it by just continuing with this reason that is still very powerful, it's still pushing, it still tries to harness the other drives, but the other drives are too strong. And so there is always a state of self-contradiction in the nature of the moderns. Among the moderns, we could put also other categories. The one Nietzsche calls the liberals, the democrats, the hedonists, and of course the progressists. The progressists are believing in the progress of science, but science and the progress of civilization is just another ghost of the Socratic equation. The fact that if we follow the right path, we will get in the end towards a just and fair society, towards the advent of a perfect human society. So for Nietzsche, that is an illusion. The hedonists are the one who have seen that they cannot attain anything, so they focus instead on a life of pleasure, but without trying to grow in any other way. The democrats, in Nietzsche's mind, gave too much importance to the possibility of the people governing themselves, which in Nietzsche's view is something that is not very interesting, because there is in the democracies the notion of equality, and for Nietzsche equality is the worst thing ever in a way, just because if we attain total equality, then it means there will be no movement at all. So it's really like that we need to understand his critique of democracy. We know that Nietzsche is not very much sometimes into political philosophy, but here we have this notion that for him democracy is equality for everyone, and equality for everyone is a state of total immobility and therefore death. It's not the possibility for the will to power to grow into more diversity, into more different shapes, powers, different actions, different growth, etc. So this is how we can understand his critique of the Democrats. The Democrats will end up leveling everything and create a gigantic bureaucratic herd of people who believe all exactly in the same way. So for Nietzsche that is not interesting in that sense. But there's ways in Nietzsche to put that into other lights, into other perspectives. So don't just take what I'm saying about democracy and Nietzsche's relation with democracy for everything that is said. Now, the liberals is an interesting case because he's very critic against, he has a huge charge against the liberals. So the liberals basically is the bourgeoisie, So people who have created institutions that would give rights to some part of the people. And the question of rights and the question of liberal institutions like education, like the military service, for example, and some rights like the rights of assembly, Nietzsche says that there is something that is tricky, that is twisted in those institutions. It is that you fight a lot to have such institutions. People fight a lot to have civil rights, for example. But what happens once they have obtained their civil rights? He says what happens is that those liberal institutions stops to be a vehicle of the will to power. They stop to be a place where you can become stronger, where you can grow, when you can find more possibilities of action. Instead, what it begins to do is to level up everybody. So education, we can see it was a great conquest, of course, to have education for everybody. But once education is for everybody, then what happens is that more and more you have standards and a standardization of teaching methods and what people are supposed to know, etc., etc. So in the end, on this point, I think Nietzsche's critique is quite interesting, because he tells us, well, your liberal institutions, you can win something, you can gain some freedom by actually going for them, going forward and win something, your rights, something that would make you able not to be dominated in the same way, but to participate in a better way, in a more great way somehow to your society. But at the same time, in the end, it can be a trap, because once you have obtained them, maybe you will just continue and accept the situation as it is, and who is at the head of those liberal institutions, and who controls what could become a breeding, in fact, even a taming of the population. So that is his critique of the modern. And then we go into the last two types on the downward side. So you've got the herd, of course, people who would just follow the priest, and at the very bottom, the priest with a spirit of resentment. Let me say just a word about the herd, because the herd is not only believers, it's everybody that follows. Nietzsche says in one barb, he says, you want followers, then look for zeros. It means followers are just zeros after a one. There is a one, maybe a priest or a prophet or something, somebody who has been a leader, somebody who has been maybe even a great man, and then you have followers. Followers, they try to mold themselves on the leader, and as such, they are not very creative. They are adaptive, they try to adapt themselves to something. Now, that would be a bit caricatural to put things just this way. There can be great followers who invent new dimensions, but at that moment, they are not followers anymore in the pure sense of the word to follow. So we have just to keep that in mind. Now, if we talk about followers, of course, we can think about religion, but let's not just focus on religion. Nietzsche was very critical about the modern state and modern bureaucracy, and the philosopher that he calls as to be the head of the modern bureaucracy is Kant. We saw before that for Nietzsche, Kant is the antipode of Goethe. So the antipode of the great man is this hero of the herd. Kant is the philosopher of the herd. He said, well, how to know if something is good or bad, an action is good or bad? Well, try to transform it into a maxim, and then try to universalize that maxim, and if it works, if it seems to give a good result, then that's a good path to follow. For example, if anybody is going to steal everything they need for food, would that give a society that would be healthy, that would be even possible? Well, Kant says no. If everybody was doing that, then of course it would be total chaos. Therefore, you should not steal anything. So that is his way of being moral through the use of universalizing reason. And of course, this dimension of the universal, what it does is to level up every behavior. Everyone has to act according to this universal possible decisions. So everybody, of course, will behave in the same way, and in the end, it gives what Nietzsche will call a herd. And there it is. Now, at the very bottom, we have the priests. We have those improvers of humanity, but you see, even in priests, you've got genius. They are a genius of resentment. People who have been able to lead huge crowds towards resentment against others. You've got anti-Semites, of course. You've got people who have destroyed completely other cultures because of hate, because of hatred, and not because. And this is very important to make a difference between different kinds of war. The kind of war that the ancient Greeks were waging against each other, against different city-states, was a war that was somehow a respectful war. It was a war, of course, to kill your enemy, to overcome yourself and take over your enemy. But it was made out of some esteem for this enemy. While a war with resentment, a war with hatred, is a war in which you consider the other as something less than you. Well, if the other is something less than you, then you don't need, obviously, to go and wage war over that person, because you know you will win. So what is the interest if your goal is the will to power, that is to grow, that is to overcome yourself in the process? What is the interest of actually wage war against somebody that is lower than you, that is not a great enemy for you? So that will be my point for today, and I'm quite happy that I could complete that with you in this video. I'm of course expecting your questions and remarks, and I would be very happy to have your feedbacks. So thank you very much.